I just wanted to begin my talk with talking exactly about these perspectives that we now have in the room. So when Nicholas Langlitz talked, he kind of was speaking from the perspective of a person working in humanities who is observing a field. Maybe he has an agenda of his own in consciousness studies. But when you now listen to me and also to Gerd Gründer lately, next after me, then I think the perspective changes because Gerd Gründer is a psychiatrist. He wants to treat patients, so he wants to achieve a good outcome, make people healthier or reduce their pathologies. And me, myself, and also with the colleagues who started the Mind Foundation and lately Ovid, we also are in another game now, because as organizations in this field, we are actually dedicated to make a change, help people to reduce human suffering or improve the life of healthy human beings. For that, we make use of concepts. And that making use of concepts is actually also the topic of my talk. Hopefully this works. Yeah. Okay. So this is the basic structure of what I would like to discuss with you. I call it explorations because this is open reflecting and open thinking about the topic of Bewusstseinskultur. The first one is more about Thomas Metzinger's ideas, then a few remarks about psychedelics in general and how they are perceived. And then this more practical practitioner, activist perspective, how can we, or we will talk about what we means, go forward in building a useful Bewusstseinskultur. And the last part will be about discussing what could we add to Thomas Metzinger's concept to create a more consensual platform for going forward. Just in a break, I discussed with two people that I cannot imagine that there would ever be a situation in the psychedelic field where we have one dominating strategy or perspective. I don't see any psychedelic dictator coming. I don't see any company having the power to really dictate one of these perspectives. The field is extremely multi-perspective already. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So first part, you've heard about that, so I may almost skip that. You've heard about the 3 steps that Thomas Metzinger postulated. And I agree very much to Nicholas Langlitz that the decade of the brain and also the development of pharmacological substances has not been a huge revolution in the sense that he might have expected it in the beginning of the 2000s. Yet a lot is going on. If you look at the European report on substances, on drugs, you see that more than 700 substances have been developed in the last 20 years. Most of them psychedelics. So Thomas' concept leads inherently to the question of education and self-education. It's actually, as I understand it, a project. It's not a mere observational theory, but he proposes Bewusstseinskultur as a cultural project. Yeah. Then, because we talked about the definition of Bewusstseinskultur already, let's dive a little bit deeper into what we could investigate as deficits of the concept of Bewusstseinskultur. So Thomas Metzinger's perspective is profoundly connected to the neuroscientific field, and at the same time includes phenomenological assessments of the mind, a combination of first and third person perspective. His concept is a hybrid between Bewusstseinsethik that might not have existed before he formulated it. So that is an assessment of the value of some states compared to others, based on a philosophy of mind and an ethics of social acts. And that is an assessment of how certain states of consciousness would likely influence others or society as a whole. So in order to create a consensus about the value or less value or not value of some states, we somehow need to generate intersubjective generalizable criteria. That's basically also such a Fink's argument. And that happens in a very Habermas way, I think, by negotiating it in the public. Actually, what we do right now, we talk to each other and discuss what we do think is valuable. So are certain states of near madness, or a psychiatrist would call it psychotic states, may be acceptable? Are they useful? In our culture, many people would say, well, probably not. When you go to some tribal cultures in the Amazon, they intentionally work with creating temporary states of madness, psychotic states, by including several substances to the ayahuasca brew, for example, or putting people under a waterfall with water dropping on their head. So the idea of treating people with temporary states of madness is accepted there. So we just have to talk about if that is the way we want to go on here in our culture. Probably it is not. So where do the criteria come from that we are using to create a consensus? And by a consensus, I don't mean that a society-wide consensus can be reached. That's not possible. We are inserting ideas into a discourse, and maybe for some time these ideas are dominant, but that's not going to dominate the whole culture. We are living in a pluralist societies. So I think these criteria can likely not only be developed from the perspectives that Thomas Metzinger brought in from mental states, but they have to come from outside. Humans are, like other animals, fundamentally social beings. And these criteria for assessing the value of our mental states would or should probably, at least partially, be derived from a political theory or a theory of living together, maybe also with other non-human beings. That would be one framework I'm talking about today. So are we in a stadium of human development where the planet itself has become a topic because of the ecological damage that we cause? Are we adopting ecology as a framework for assessing the value of psychedelic states? That is one perspective. Also, that argument pretty much is an argument against the heroic way of looking at internal states. The heroic way is the Buddhist monk sitting in the cave for 10 years, is the Ernst Jünger way of fighting in realms of consciousness for certain experiences that you have, but others don't. That is only one way of seeing it. The other way is arguing for consensus and cooperation. examples of other challenges for Bewusstseinskultur. So there are psychedelic subcultures. In a moment, I'll show another slide that gives a little bit of an overview that had the tendencies in the last decades of self-marginalizing and self-centeredness. So citing Sasha Fink, those cultures that care for cultivating specific experience per se are in disrepute in our society of being esoteric, hippie, or navel-gazing. If psychedelics are going to become medicine in psychiatry, or later even, or even at the same time, an instrument of changing our relationship to nature or changing our relationship to human beings beyond our family, we have to change that. We have to create a culture where we can openly talk about the logic, the downsides, and the upsides of psychedelics. And that also includes the dark logic of psychedelics. I think there is not enough talk about the dark logic of psychedelics. Talking about the dark logic enables us to see where the potentials are. Yeah, I'm jumping over that argument. So in my 10-year longitudinal study that I conducted at the University of Heidelberg, I was not in that position that I'm now in. I'm now a person trying to find evidence for the value of some psychedelic experiences for treating, for example, depression. At that time, I was rather looking, having that bird view perspective. And if you have that, you see that the psychedelic underground for many years was very multivocal. There are religions fighting with more modern yoga form, lifestyle spiritualities. There have always been psychotherapeutic perspectives, either from the 1950s or from underground. Nowadays, they are coming from renowned universities. There have always been political activists, mostly in the, I also agree with Nicholas, from the liberal side. That might be changing at the moment. And there have been psychonauts. Psychonauts, a diverse group of people who are somehow putting their narratives around, I would in many cases call it a heroic journey of exploring yourselves with psychedelics, often high doses of psychedelics. Just showing that, I want to make the argument I want to make with that is that for creating a space for psychedelics in our society and in our medical schools and in our universities, we need to have criteria that help us to see which kind of or which contexts of are acceptable to society for making the psychedelic experience. Yeah, psychedelics. As I mentioned in my question to Nicolas Langlitz before, they of course can be defined in very different ways. Nicolas cited Aldous Huxley, and he definitely meant that psychedelics are manifesting a more universal mind within one being. Most of the time when I hear researchers talk about that definition of psychedelics nowadays, they mean it differently. They mean it an individual's psyche is manifested within the psychedelic experience, including biographical elements, including maybe experiences of merging with the other human being, including visionary dreamlike experiences, and maybe also oneness experiences, but it's rather a bouquet of different experiences than that oneness experience. That already shows in the, that also shows in the more quantitative instruments that we have for measuring. They are also not going for dimensional criteria. Even the Altered States of Consciousness questionnaire has these 11 different dimensions of experience that actually come from people having reported qualitatively about their experience. I also see that process of looping in, of course, when you're giving, when you're even preparing patients or even preparing people in a human development setting for what might happen. You're, of course, introducing, you're priming them with concept, but there's nothing bad about that. That happens in any culture. We just need, I think, from the perspective of a scientifically informed culture of consciousness, we just need to be aware of the concepts that we're using. So in Shipibo cultures, often the psychedelic experience is about contacting the spirits or contacting the ancestors. That is also the case in synthetic, syncretistic religions. So when I did my interview theories with people who consume ayahuasca in the Santo Daime Church, I often heard that the reason why they're using psychedelics is they want to be a vessel, a container for the spirits to enter them. So there are always cultural ideas that drive people's psychedelic experience. And I think from an ethical and also medical perspective, it is our job to create and communicate a number of ideas that are healthy for people, that help them to create better lives. And that is far from just having a bird perspective. People tell us in these instruments, this is the Griffith paper that has often been cited, that the psychedelic experiences that they had within an academic setting is very often one of the most important experiences of their life. Of course, these have often been very depressed or otherwise pathologically affected patients who have a motivation to have a deep experience. But that's good. That's what you're using when you want to change something. You want to use the expectations of people. Something that keeps me thinking when having scientific conferences and conversations is that we have a very, very fuzzy concept about spiritualities. So we don't, spiritualities or spirituality is something like Lakoff and Johnson's empty concepts. Everybody projects something into that. So one thing I would ask a researcher or a therapist in a study that Gert will be the principal investigator of a study that is hopefully going to start at the end of the year, to have a clarified, a transparent view about what spirituality means to the therapist, in order not to impose a form of spirituality on the patient that might be unhealthy. For example, going for that oneness experience necessarily, because that's not the only thing that is helpful for people when taking psychedelics. Yeah, in outside of the treatment or medical field, there are also some studies that show that people profit from psychedelic experience in very general ways that have not necessarily been expected before. For example, in the MacLean study that you show here and others following, it has been shown that a basic personality trait like openness has been changed by people who ingested psychedelic substances only once or twice. And that's really astonishing. There are not a lot of instruments in medicine or in psychotherapy that have an effect like that. Cognitive flexibility, creativity, well-being, life satisfaction. Here you can actually see that we need to talk about the values that we want to propose in a scientifically related culture of consciousness. Cognitive flexibility is something that is valuable in a society that wants to be democratic, that wants people to debate, that wants people to maybe change their profession, change their homes where they live many times in their lifetime. Cognitive flexibility is not necessarily something that you need in a stable, traditional society. Yeah. How do psychedelics work? That's again an answer to the more monistic claim of some religions or some spiritual people or some researchers. They actually work in very different ways. There are reports of cases where it's very clear that the challenging experience that would otherwise have been labeled as a bad trip was a really positive experience for a patient, because it signified kind of a turn in life, an intensive experience from which on this person was able to make a life-changing decision. So a bad trip can, by having a context of people around the person who is tripping, really be changed into something that is actually good and positive for that person. Some people profit by cognitive restructuring. Generally, the Carhart-Harris group and others have shown that under the influence of psychedelics, people are more context sensitive. And that's why having facilities and places that are well thought through in terms of architecture and in terms of people interacting is such a pivotal element of an ethical culture of consciousness. Then again, Gerd would be the better one to talk about it. There is probably something going on the neuronal level. So we have a therapy that is working with psychotherapeutic elements, but also on the neuronal level, and maybe not only in the brain. Some psychedelics seem to have anti-inflammatory value too. Yeah, building Bewusstseinskultur. So building means you want to do something. That is not necessarily what a researcher in a humanities faculty has or wants to do, but that's what the companies and the academics and the therapists want to do. So I try to formulate some principles that could be the basis of debate in this room and in a scientific discourse for defining a ethically well and healthy shaped culture of consciousness. One principle is collaboration, care, and mature communities. So for reinforcing the beneficial qualities that we saw on this slide, that would be experienced beneficial by many people, not only patients, clients, many human beings would need mature others around them that help them to relate to the psychedelic experience and reinforce these positive experiences. So the question really is, how can a society that is not tribal, like in the case of these Amazon tribes, wherever, create spaces in cities, on the countryside, or even digitally, where people who have made that experience and profited from that reinforce it. So one idea is, of course, one idea that also the Mind Foundation and Ovid is thinking about, to create stable communities of small groups of people that are accompanied maybe even not only months, but even years ahead of time. So programs, that's what modern societies have been able to do. That is what a rationalization probably of this experience would mean, building programs that people follow. In the Mind Foundation, one of the first things that we created was that program Beyond Experience. Some of you have participated in that program. That is specifically designed as a group process where people open up and make transparent why they had a psychedelic experience, what it did to them, why they want to have more, or why they stopped doing that. So that open and transparent dialogue in mature communities that are not about always retaking the psychedelic, but thinking about which qualities it created that might improve the lives of people is one element of a culture of consciousness that I could imagine to be scientifically based and ethically sound. Then colleagues of mine, I was also on the paper, and some research groups lately did research about experiential qualities that people reported when going through a psychedelic experience. Acceptance of painful, acceptance also of extremely pleasurable, but acceptance of traumatic experience was one of these qualities. That's where the mature communities or the psychedelic therapists come in, helping people to find their way around that experiential avoidance that seems to be naturally coming with human beings or with beings, with biological beings when trying to avoid pain. So building Bewusstseinskultur then would not be about psychonautic adventure, but would be about facing realities and pains in this world, or facing realities in your own consciousness. There are problematic developments in underground, but maybe also in the future of patients who have been treated in legal, academic, or other facilities. So what we already see, there are people with chaotic self-treatments, poly-use of substances. It's very rare that people only use psychedelics. Yeah? Things like naive guruism, toxic individualism. So these are the things that I mentioned that I think is important to talk about in a culture of consciousness that tries to be transparent and open to consent building. What do we want to do? With we now, I mean the two companies that I also represent. We want to build, or we're actually doing that with these rooms that we have opened in Berlin Friedrichshain, but that's our next project. We want to build a place where such debate can happen, transparent, open, in public discourse, and where people can show states of mind that are not necessarily only limited to the states of minds that people usually learn in school. What did we learn in school in the last 200 years? To sit still, to control our bodies, to have enormous control of our bodies, sitting in school for 13 years, talking. So psychedelic therapies and psychedelic states and the times that people go through those psychedelic states might just be a complementary space to a culture that has trained people in being in a certain way and identity. So my last point, my last exploration is actually Bewusstseinskultur as a resource of secular spiritualities. Those who know me in my presentations know my skepticism about the re-emergence of, let's call it, wild transcendental and wild spiritual theories or ideas through psychedelic culture. So with ayahuasca culture, for example, there was a lot of ideas from 17th and 18th century Europe that emigrated to the Amazon, was coming back again. Spiritist ideas of transcendental beings that are now there again. And there is not a lot of talk about the realism, the epistemological nature of these views. And that would be another quality that I would propose for a culture of consciousness, a modern culture of consciousness, to make these assumptions explicit and to talk to people about where they got that from and what's the epistic nature of these ideas. So I think that such a Bewusstseinskultur can help to liberate the term and the practices of spirituality from a lot of anti-scientific or metaphysical and religious traditions that know very well and know too well what is true. These traditions often focus human beings on transcendental worlds instead of being here. Now, being here, I don't necessarily mean that in the East-Western tradition of training to be here. That's also part of that argument, but I mean it more in the way of a critique to our societies, Western societies, global societies, going for undetermined futures, progressivism. Nobody thinks about it, nobody can control where technical progress takes us to at the moment. Maybe an enlarged dialogue about what people really need to be satisfied, happy human beings would help a larger portion, a larger group of people to formulate their ideas of how much progress and which kind of progress they need. A secular spirituality could then be defined as a lifelong process of learning to be here, to get along with what you have as a human being, with as little self-illusion and as little projection as possible. And that would maybe come with developing one's potential in coexisting with other beings. So, last proposal that I make as elements of a discourse on the value of psychedelic experiences is, I think we need to talk about political theory and an understanding of how we want to live that cannot come from the investigation of consciousness only. If Bewusstseinskultur is to gain relevance beyond small academic circles, it needs to have such a discourse on how do we want to live. For the sake of providing an example that goes well along with some experiential qualities that are reported by users of psychedelics, I give a very brief insight into the capabilities theory of Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen. This is a liberal theory, political theory that has been adapted by parts of the UN, parts of UN policies as an alternative to gross Bruttosozialprodukt. How do you translate that? GDP. Yeah. So these are two thinkers that have developed an alternative view on that. So what they are proposing, and I'm not saying that this is, where is it? I don't have it here, so I have to tell you that I have it here on my slide. They have been proposing measures for the good life that partly come from their investigation of ancient Greek philosophies, but also from an investigation of economy. And what you read there is qualities that they call capabilities that any good life, any good human life should be able to develop. It starts with actually being able to live, not being involved in war, keeping bodily health, keeping bodily integrity, but also something like respect for other species. And now we're in the middle of an ethical dialogue about which framework do we want to provide, even for our therapies. Is having respect for the human species and other species something that a medical doctor or a therapist should reflect upon? I think we can agree, probably we can agree, that a medical doctor or a therapist should not impose such an idea on his patient. But if it comes up in a therapy, and maybe if a psychotherapeutic facility is built in a way that that invites people to make that experience, that would probably be acceptable to many of us. I'm not going through the whole list of capabilities that Martha Nussbaum in this case has formulated. I'm just giving that as an example of a political theory, of a theory of life that has to come from outside of a theory of mind, that we need to debate to create an impactful culture of consciousness. One last I would like to mention is the capability to play. Do we want to create a culture? Do we want to help people in developing their personalities so that they still have the possibility to play like children? That is something that is a major element of this political philosophy. Last point, I made it already in this talk. Another thing that we have to talk about is, should we take what people report nowadays in their psychedelic experience? Having made an experience of deeper connection with the natural things that they consist of, beings outside of themselves. I don't mean spiritual beings. I mean animals, people that are, and plants that surround them. Should we make that a topic of our therapies and of our human development contexts? I think there is reason to do so. And that's what I would like to debate with you. Thank you very much.